Wampum strings, belts, and mats are an integral part of our Haudenosaunee culture, communication, and treaty system. They symbolize our living history and guide us in our relationships with others.
Wampum belts are basically how we documented our important agreements and covenants and treaties, whatever you want to call it. Everything had to be done with wampum. When people want to talk about Haudenosaunee history, you inevitably are talking about wampum belts. And that was to kind of make it eternal. They were used in ceremony and also diplomacy and trade. So it was a perfect marriage.
The early use of wampum was to guide negotiations and to ratify agreements at council meetings with other Haudenosaunee nations and ultimately with settlers. Wampum is important to remind our leaders to maintain the peace and to make decisions not only for today, but for future Haudenosaunee yet unborn.
When it came to wampum, at least they had a medium where they could meet and trade and communicate with each other. On a spiritual level, it allowed people to actively engage with each other, even if they didn't agree or even if they didn't really fully understand each other's language. At least it gave them that medium of exchange. They're great memorials because those were the documentation of oral tradition.
Wampum was used as a way to greet each other. They were the blueprints by which treaties or agreements with other nations would be structured.
And these were the things that we kept to signify we accept that promise that was made at the council. So you would go to a council with ready-made wampum belts, you would present them to the people you're negotiating with. If they accepted them, that means we're keeping that, we agree with those words, we're going to keep this forever. Because someday you may have to break that belt out to go back and say, do you remember when you promised this under the eyes of God?
Some of the most famous historical wampum belts include the Dust Fan Belt, the Alliance Belt, and the Hiawatha Belt.
The most important belt that people talk about relating to indigenous affairs, internal, would be the one they call the Hiawatha Belt. Basically it means, you know, one family, one nation, one land, all united. This is the dominant symbol of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It was a natural fit to be turned into a big flag. This is the original form. Not so much a belt, but a mat. Symbolically where the Confederacy would sit when they came together. At the center is the Tree of Peace, which was planted when these 5 nations came together to formulate a peace plan between them. And the Tree of Peace is symbolic of all diplomacy and all friendly relations with other nations. So it doesn't just apply to the Confederacy, but applies to our relations with the colonies, with other confederacies, and also there's a chain. The tree is connected to links of a chain. That is also an indigenous concept.
The Tworow Wampum is a living treaty, and the Haudenosaunee people viewed the Tworow as a peaceful way to coexist with others.
Before Europeans came, it was just a single footpath between villages, between nations. But then when the Europeans came with their trade and their wagons, suddenly that little footpath becomes 2. So that has to be protected, you know. So when you make peace with an enemy, what you're saying is we open the road between your nation and ours so that you can pass freely to us. The one that people typically call the Cultural Wampum is actually, that's the metaphor that was in these kind of belts, was that this is the road between different nations. They call this Degani Deohate in Mohawk, meaning 2 paths.
Wampum belts are important because they represent the strong union between nations and that each nation is equal under the laws of the Haudenosaunee. They helped communicate ideas and record history between the indigenous people and Europeans.
Some people think of treaties as just being those final agreement documents with, you know, they're written on parchment and, you know, in ink with a quill. That's what a lot of people think of when they see it. They hear the word treaty, but the treaty was also the speeches that were given leading up to that document. They were the wampum belts, and these were used in those negotiations. This is how it happened. So these were a part of the treaty process. The United States still remembers those treaty relationships. For instance, in Canandaigua, every fall I think it's coming up pretty soon, is they do a commemoration of the Treaty of Canandaigua. And that was the United States under George Washington saying, we remember all the ancient agreements, we inherit that, and we want to continue that.
Wampum and treaties are important factors in guiding decisions that will impact the generations to come. Knowledge of their existence and meaning helps to dispel myths about the Indigenous peoples of Canada and our ways of being, from the past to the present.